Right. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. Today, I will be giving you a presentation on GDP, a major principle, and the first principle you should learn of macroeconomics, and what we'll be using to measure progress throughout the semester. And it's going to help us determine how do we measure progress. So first of all, if we're going to talk about GDP and its uses, I think it's best we know what GDP is to start off. Of course, if we don't know what GDP is, then we can't do anything with it. So GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it's the aggregation of all values and production and services by a nation in a year. This would be an example would be this would be all of the products the United States makes and sells that are new to the people. So it's the value in money of all of those goods and services. So we calculate this by multiplying the quantity of those goods by the market price of those goods. So a good example that I've seen is if you have 10 bananas and the market price of bananas is $10, your GDP is $100 because it's the 10 bananas times the $10. You have $100 worth of value on you in that moment. Thus, you have $100 worth of GDP. So here are some notable things we won't include when calculating GDP. So used goods. So if you go to a car dealership and you get a used car, we don't count that towards GDP. If you buy a house from somebody who's already owned the house or somebody owned it before you, we do not count that towards GDP because it's already been counted. The first time it's bought, when it's new, is counted towards GDP. If we do it again, we're double counting. We're double counting, and we want to prevent double counting as much as we can when calculating GDP. Next, we have intermediate goods. We're going to come back to those later, and we'll talk more in depth here in a few seconds. But the basic premise would be a good that you buy, and then you use it to make another good that you sell. So we don't count those as well. Pollution doesn't have a cash value. It doesn't have a value tied to it that we can determine. Thus, we can't count it towards GDP. Crime and underground transactions, so any sort of drug dealing, weapons deals, robbing banks, not putting money on your taxes, all of that can't be included because they don't go on your taxes. We don't know who did it, what they sold, how much they sold it for, the production that was put into it, the money that was put into it. So we don't actually know what those values are. Thus, we can't count it towards GDP, if that makes sense. And finally, the big one is cash transactions. So this includes babysitting, volunteer service, mowing lawns, all of that without a set like value by a company or or just doing work that doesn't have a set cash value. It doesn't get reported on your taxes. Thus, we can't put it in GDP because the way we calculate GDP in big corporations is through taxes. That's how we record the goods and the prices. So if it's not recorded in the taxes, we can't calculate it. So all of those services not included. So here are the big problems with GDP. I mean, we just talked about a bunch of these already, but GDP does not include crime. So any sort of stolen items, stolen money can't be calculated toward GDP because that's value that's been lost and has not been counted. It's not put on your taxes. I mean, I don't think they're going to put it on their taxes. I could be wrong though. And then underground transactions, like we said, we don't know who, what, where, when, and how much. Thus, we can't count it. So that's a huge amount of money we're missing in GDP. Doesn't include the cash services that we talked about. So babysitting, volunteer work. We're missing a lot of money that definitely is there. But another cash service I think that we can talk about too is if you're growing carrots, if I'm your neighbor and you're growing carrots, I come over to you and I say, hey, let me buy one of your carrots for $3. You and I agree, I buy that carrot from you for $3. Those $3 aren't also counted towards GDP because you're not going to put those $3 on your taxes, are you? No. At least I don't think you will. And so the only way it would go towards GDP is if you had a small business. If you had a business that sold those carrots for $3 a piece and it got reported on your taxes, those would count towards GDP. But when I just come across when I come down and I ask for one for $3, we make a cash transaction, it won't count towards GDP. We can't count that. So just through experience, we know that happens often enough to where we're probably missing out on a bunch there too, as long with all of those services that are not being counted as well. And problem number 3, GDP does not count for pollution. Pollution doesn't have a value. It doesn't get put on taxes. It doesn't have anything like that. So we can't count it. It doesn't have a value. So if a company just dumps oil in a river and now we have to, that doesn't have value. It doesn't have a cash value. It doesn't get put on the company's taxes. It doesn't get put on, the river doesn't have taxes. It can't be counted whatsoever towards GDP. And I said we'd come back to intermediate goods. So let's talk about those now. So long story short, they're goods that are used, they're bought by a firm, and they're used to make another product, which is then sold to people. So my example I have here is grapes. Grapes are a great intermediate good. Grapes, if a company buys grapes and they make grape juice, say they bought the grapes for $3, they sell the grape juice for $7. It's not $10 worth of GDP. It's only 7. Because if we count the grapes for 3 and then the grape juice for 7, we're double counting. We don't want to double count the same product or the same money for GDP. So a good way to know the difference between these intermediate goods and these final goods that we'll call that are the ones counted towards GDP is if the person who buys the product is the last person to hold it, then it's a final good. So if I were to buy these grapes for $3 and I ate them or I used them for something else and I kept them for myself, then we count that towards GDP. But if I buy the grapes and I make grape juice and I sell that grape juice, those $3 don't contribute to GDP, only the $7 of grape juice that I've made. So here's a practice problem just to make sure we understand what we're talking about. So we have, I'd like to name 3 services that would not be included in calculating GDP. So you can pause the recording if you'd like to think about it. Otherwise, I'll give a couple seconds, then I'm going to move on. So we just spent the last couple minutes talking about all of these things that aren't counted in these 3 services. So the 3 services I have here are babysitting, lawn mowing, and volunteer work. 2 of which we talked about. So they're unpaid labor that is not reported on taxes. I mean, I'll keep saying it over and over again. These are jobs that are contributing. These are services that are contributing, but they aren't reported. They aren't a set value. There isn't somebody keeping track of all of it. Thus, it can't go towards GDP. And volunteer work is unpaid and it doesn't have a set cash value. Thus, we can't calculate it towards GDP either. So those are ones that are not reported on taxes, unpaid. They just don't, we have no possible way of keeping track of them and calculating them. So now we can use our knowledge of GDP and its calculation to measure the wealth of nations around the world. So here's a list of countries on here and their GDP. So China with 25.4 trillion, US with 20.5 trillion, India $10.5 trillion. This is in 2018, also notice. And I mean, like countries like Finland, not even not even cracking the top 15. So, but this is a good way of us noting which country production. So now there's different forms of GDP. We have nominal GDP, which is calculated at the price at the time of the sale. So if we were to calculate the nominal GDP of apples in 2016, we would use the quantity of apples produced in 2016 and multiply it by the price of apples in 2016, that market price, to calculate the nominal GDP. And if we were to do it in, say, 2020, we would take the quantity of apples in 2020 and multiply it by the price of apples in 2020. So if you can catch on, if we were to compare the GDP of those two, we don't have a way of determining whether it was the production that caused the change or the price that causes the change, because they're two different variables that are changing. So say in between 2016 and 2020, there was a shortage of apples, right? And the price skyrockets because there's that shortage, but the production's going way down. We don't have a way, just by looking at the GDPs, of knowing that the production or the production or the price has changed those levels of production. GDP is meant to calculate production. Thus, comparing to nominal GDPs doesn't do a lot for us. We can't use it to compare things over time or the change itself or the different prices. So that's our big issue with nominal GDP. We don't know what causes the change or which variable it is. That's why we use what's called real GDP. So real GDP adjusts for the prices at the time. This is allowing us now to compare over multiple years without us having to consider price or inflation as a factor. So going back to our example, this would be using the 2016 quantities and multiplying them by the 2024 price, and then the 2020 quantity times the 2024 price. Thus, we know what the production is. It's only the production that can come out with a different value or cause an increase in GDP, rather than it being the quantity and the price and the change in price. It becomes less by circumstance and more by production. We want to solely consider production rather than price. So how can we use these to measure progress and prosperity? How do we know if people are living a prosperous life using GDP? So we know that if you take China, which we saw earlier has a huge GDP, versus Finland, which we saw wasn't on that list earlier, do we think that the people in Finland are living a more prosperous life than the people in China? I would argue that the people in Finland are probably living have better living standard of living than China. But yet China has a higher GDP. So how can we take the proportions and make it the same almost? How can we compare the two? We're comparing apples to bananas right now. So how do we change it to apples and apples or bananas and bananas? Well, what we can do is we can take the GDP, the real GDP, and we divide it by the population. We divide it per person, which is called by capita. And we got to use the real GDP because remember, nominal GDP doesn't account for the prices at the time. We use two different prices. We can't determine whether it's the price or the production that makes one more valuable than the other. So if we use real GDP per capita, we can measure the quality of life between two nations, such as China and Finland. If the Finnish have a higher GDP per capita, that's more money per person. That's more production per person. That's higher standard of living per person. But with China, if it's it'll be a lower value. That's less money per person. So that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. And then another term I want to talk about is regression or recession. So if a nation's GDP decreases 2 quarters in a row, then this is considered a recession. a term used in politics a lot over the last turn of centuries, since the turn of the century. So here's a graph for you from the 1979 to 1982. And this line right here, this red line represents the average increase in GDP. And then this line right here with the dashes represents 0% increase. So we can see here we have increases, and then in 1980, quarter two, we have a decrease in GDP, in the production that year. And then we have a huge increase right here. So you can see the huge jump right here in the third quarter in 1980, and then this decrease again. So the main thing I want to point out is that for nations' GDP's increases and decreases, it won't be a linear line. It won't be a straight line all the time. It'll be huge increases, huge decreases, and bouncing back and forth all the time. But here in 1981 and 1982, we have 2 points below zero in a row. That is a regression right here. There was a regression at the end of 1981 and 1982 in the beginning. That was a regression. So the decrease in GDP over 2 quarters in a row. All right, I have a second set of practice problems here. If a nation produces 100 bananas in 2016 and the price of the bananas in 2016 is $24 and the price of bananas in 2024 is $31. We have 4 problems here. What is the nation's nominal GDP in 2016? So remember, for nominal GDP, we take the product, the quantity, and we multiply it by the price. So it'll be just $2,400, 24 times 100, 2,400. So the nominal GDP of this nation in the bananas was $2,400 in 2016. So now we have the nominal GDP in 2024. So this one's a little bit more tricky because it's actually not doable. We can't calculate it because remember, we need the 2024 quantity times the 2024 price. Here we don't have a 2024 quantity. We only have a 2016 quantity. Thus, we can't calculate nominal GDP. We can only calculate real GDP with 2024. So we don't know the nominal GDP of this nation at that time. So now let's use the real GDP of 2016 using 2024 prices. So we have 100 bananas, the 2016 quantity of 100 bananas times the 2024 price, $31. So $3,100 would be the real GDP in 2016 bananas. And finally, the real GDP per capita in 2016. We got to do a little more work for this one. So we have a population of 3,100. We got 100 bananas, and we have $31. So of course, we take our value from the last one through $3,100. We're going to divide that by the number of citizens, and then that gives us the real GDP per capita. It is $1 per person. Probably not a huge quality of life if you're only getting $1 per person. But it's just a banana market, so I'm sure they're doing fine somewhere else. But hopefully this all made sense for the most part. These are pretty important skills and math that you should be able to do in order to move forward in macro. And then lastly, we have our other forms of calculating GDP. We have an expenditure approach of consumption plus investments plus government expenditures plus exports minus imports. So what does all of this actually mean? What do all these variables actually mean? Because I just threw a lot at you. So C, consumption it's the basic consumption. So you go out to the store, you buy orange juice, that is consumption. If I buy a phone, that is considered consumption. Any sort of buying of a product by a consumer is consumption. So all of that money is put into the expenditure approach. And then investment's a little bit more of a tricky one. So if I worked for Apple and Apple bought me this phone so that I can so that I can use it at work. They buy me a computer for my work so that I can do it at home. Those are investments. Those aren't consumption because they're buying them to help the firm. It's a firm buying products for the firm. So all of the monitors, all of the computers, all of the desks, all the furniture, that's all investment rather than consumption. And then government expenditures, I feel like that's a little bit more of a simplistic one that we can use or to understand, but that's the government buying products for themselves for other people. It's buying products. It's not giving money, it's buying products. And then exports minus imports. So that's an important one because if we're exporting what's going out, imports what's coming in to our country and what we're selling out versus what we're buying to bring in. So if imports, if we're bringing in and we're buying more than we're selling, this will be a negative number, right? But if we're pushing out and we're selling more than we're bringing in, it'll be a positive number. So that's a good thing to know for that. And another way we can calculate it is this income approach. To simplify the formula down for you, it is wages plus interest plus rent plus profits. So this would be if the time I use this formula would be for like if I'm calculating for a store. If I'm calculating for Walmart, I would use the income approach. It'd be the wages for all the people, the profits they've made, the interest rates at the time and all their interest, and the products they are renting at the time. All of that goes into GDP for Walmart. And then the point of both of these is that it depends on the variables you have, of course. You have to be able to work with both variables, and the further we get along, the less we're going to be able to use the quantity times price. We're not going to be able to use that one nearly as much as we get to tougher problems. So what we'll do is I tend to stick with the expenditure one, but no matter what, if you use expenditure or income, they should come out to the same value. If they don't come out to the same value, you've done something wrong with one of them. So they always come out to the same value. All right, so that's all I have on GDP. I'm hoping that this was a good introduction to GDP and calculation and measures of progress for you. Um, Let me know if you have any questions about it. I'd be happy to explain them. And thank you very much, and I hope you have a blessed day.